All right, so now it's time to actually paint our model now that we kind of understand what these different create new paint layer panel says. So let's do a 2048 TIFF, and we'll do the diffuse channel, and I'll say OK. And I have my paintbrush selected, and I'm just going to paint a line. And as you can see, it paints based on the camera's position. So if I'm on the side and I'm kind of painting like this, I'm painting based on where my camera is looking and also where my mouse is clicking, obviously. So by default, basically your model has no texture on it. Even though it has this kind of brown color, that color doesn't actually exist. That's just the placeholder material color that Mudbox uses. So the very first thing we want to do is we want to get a base coat down. I'm going to pick white because I like to use white as my base coat. And what we're going to do is in this tool menu, so I have the paintbrush selected, there's one that just says flood paint layer. Let's just click that, and that will flood your entire image, okay? And that's really what you want to do. You really want to start by flooding your paint layer with an undercoat, okay? Now remember, we're painting on the same layer here, so keep that in mind. I'm going to switch to, let's do kind of a red. And we can pick the size of our brush over here. We can also use the Photoshop shortcuts, the bracket keys, to go bigger and smaller. You can see there I am painting. Let's lower the strength of this brush. You can see it's just like, it's more like almost like airbrushing. Okay. As we kind of add some more subtle fall off. Let's turn that back up. Let's look at the mirror options, which we haven't really talked about yet, but are some of the most powerful here. So let's do, as I'm scrolling through these, you can see what's happening is it's jumping around and showing me how it's going to mirror my model, or my brush. So if I do Z, all right, so I'm mirroring Z, make my brush a little bit smaller. Whenever I paint on one side, okay, it's going to paint on the other. So I can get two painting at once. Pretty cool. You can mirror Y, so it's one painting on the top and one on the bottom. Switch my colors so you can see it a little bit better. All right, and it's based on this grid right now. This is the world X and world Y, but we can also pick local and tangent space too. Go ahead and play with those mirroring though. Below that I have use stamp image. So if I use the stamp image, I can pick a stamp from down here. Let's say I pick these leaves. I can make my brush a little bit larger. Oh, I accidentally turned my strength down there. And you can see what's happening is it's taking some of the color data and mixing it with this stamp. All right, let's switch our stamp up to this kind of almost like scale pattern. I'm going to change the color to kind of a darker gray, and we could randomize the stamp, as you can see there. We can also change the stamp spacing here. So it stamps it fewer times. Steady stroke is something you can explore, which will let you basically create really nice sharp lines if you're not using like a Wacom tablet. Again, you can use a tablet with this, it works just fine. Alright, so let's turn off the stamp, and notice how whenever I paint, it doesn't paint the full size of my brush. What's happening is in the fall off menu, there's actually a bunch of different options here with how you change how the brush is working. You can select some fall off presets down here too. Let's pick this one that's just square. And you can see what happens is it just immediately does a full size of my brush, like as if the whole thing is the same sort of density of paint. These different curves create different looks and different feels. It's totally your preference. So explore those different fall-offs. All right, so as I'm painting this more and more detailed, I can kind of layer these colors. Let's use some of our different tools. Let's talk about the projection tool. So the projection brush is supposed to work with a stencil. We have the stamp tab that we've been using, but here's the stencil tab. And a stencil is basically an image that's going to get overlaid on our screen that we then paint directly onto the surface. So let's pick a stencil. Let's pick this brick. And if I just paint, it's painting that picture onto my model. Now this is camera based, so as I rotate the model around and paint, it's going to rotate the view. I can zoom out to have bigger bricks. I can zoom in to have smaller bricks. See the difference there? On this little side panel over here, we have some of the options here. Moving the stencil around requires you to hold the S key. So I can rotate the stencil. I can scale the stencil. I can pan the stencil. And then simply paint it in. Now the number one thing I get asked is, can I use custom images with this? Absolutely. So let's get a custom image in. We're going to go up to the image browser. You click this little folder icon to find a folder. I'm just using my pictures folder. You pick an image in here. I'm going to pick this one. And then up here there's a couple different options, and this one that says S is set stencil. So let's click that. So now it's set my stencil. I go back to my 3D view. There's my stencil, and I can paint it on. Let's hide our stencil with Q. Looking pretty cool. The eyedropper just grabs the color. The Airbrush tool lets you do more kind of subtle airbrushing. Pencil tool is for harsh lines. Paint erase lets you erase the paint. The clone stamp tool works just like the clone stamp in Photoshop. You hold Control, sample from one area, and you can paint it somewhere else. Dry brush is really interesting. Dry brush will only paint the higher areas, or you can switch it so it only paints the lower areas. So with my dry brush, it should only paint the protrusions. It's not working too well because of this model, but it's only going to paint the protrusions based on the strength that you use. Or not the strength, actually. I think it's, I thought there was a specific option in here. It might be under advanced. Yeah, you can basically change it based on that, but it'll paint the higher, so see how it's not painting these little divots? So it's only painting the higher areas that I initially click. So if you have something like, like little spikes or something, it can work with that. If you hold Control, it'll only paint the lower areas and not the higher areas. I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm holding Control. See how it's only painting the lower areas and not the higher. Blur works just like a Photoshop blur. You can blur areas. Dodge works just like Photoshop, where it increases the brightness of that area. Burn makes it darker and more contrasty. Contrast enhances the contrast, enhances the differences between the brightest parts and the darkest parts. Sponge basically removes saturation or adds saturation if you hold Control. Hue will take a hue that you select and apply it across the board. So it'll take the areas that have some hue in them. So like this green or this red, it'll convert that to being red. And then hue shift is really fun, where you can have it shift the hue based on a certain number of degrees. So as you paint, it'll just totally create some wonky effects. And then invert does the opposite, right? It shifts it from being white to black and black to white, and so on. So those are the paint tools, how to use a stencil, how to import a custom stencil, and that's the basics of the diffuse layer. In the next video, we're going to talk about the other types of layers that you can create.